Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Howard Bargroff, and I am a re-recording mixer or dubbing mixer, depending on whether I'm doing a film, when I'm a re-recording mixer, or a TV show where I'm a dubbing mixer. And I've got no idea why I've got two different titles. But I'm here essentially to tell you kind of what I do, I guess, and I suppose how I got there, and then maybe I'll go through some of the nuts and bolts and open the floor up to questions, and then we can get into more detailed stuff. Maybe we can talk about virtual mixing, hard mixing, all that stuff. So the title of the talk was actually adding sound to the vision, and this is and what I actually mean about this, and I'll try and if I get time, I'll try and touch on this, is adding sound to the vision. When I say vision, I mean the vision of the clients, the vision of the project you're trying to actually work on. So it's about our job as kind of sound practitioners is about telling a story. That's our kind of entire raison d'etre. That's why we're there. So it is about bedding in with the project and understanding what you're trying to do, and allowing the technology not to get in the way, but to help you kind of realize what you're trying to do. So just to give you some background, I started off in the music business at Psalm Studios. First of all, as a technical engineer. Then I got a hankering for actually working in the studio. Took a massive pay cut, went back to work on reception for 6 months or something, and then ended up back as an assistant in the studio, worked my way through, became a house engineer, looked after mixing projects, some Take That, some Kylie, that kind of stuff. Then I left to go and work with a producer who decided about 6 months after I left to stop working. So then I found myself with no work and penniless. So I saw an advert in a paper, and I went to go and work at Dolby Labs as a sound consultant, a Dolby sound consultant, and then found this whole other world of sound engineering, which I didn't really know existed. And I remember one of the clearest memories I have of that time is walking into Pinewood Studio in, I think it was Theatre 2, which is enormous, great studio, enormous cinema, walking into a cinema with a mixing desk in the middle, and thinking, that's two of the things I like the most, cinema and a mixing desk. I thought, this is the way to go. And at that point, I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to get into post-sound. I then left Dolby after a couple of years, after having an absolutely brilliant training from Dolby and learning loads of stuff about the technicalities of film mixing, which has also helped me in TV mixing as well, as the worlds converge. And then worked my way up through various other facilities around Soho in like Delaney and Future Post, which is no more, and ultimately then became a film re-recording mixer and started to find myself doing more and more TV. And as the worlds have converged, which is something, again, if I get time, I'll try and talk about how the technologies are now the same between both worlds, found myself doing more and more TV work. So now I look after, so film work I've mixed, I've helped out on Chicken Run, I've mixed Tinker Tailor, TV work Sherlock, Broadchurch, etc., etc. So, and what I've found over the years is actually the two mixing styles are becoming more and more similar. There's not as many technical considerations between TV and film as there used to be. So that's how I got here. So just to go through roughly what it is I do, hopefully at some point I make a soundtrack. So I mix the sound for for picture projects, which we can break down into 3 distinct sections: dialogues, music, and effects. And although I'm going to be breaking stuff down into sections, obviously there's blurred lines between all of these disciplines. So a soundtrack is made up of a dialogue, music, and effects. Now the dialogues are made up of sync sound on the left and ADR and crowd. Sync is stuff that's recorded on set as the actors are talking. ADR is stuff that is recorded in addition. So if the recordings are compromised for whatever reason, like there's planes going over or trains next to where they're shooting. For instance, a classic example is a lot of period dramas are always filmed in stately homes next to motorways. Which is quite an interesting thing when you hear the sound of cars going and something set in like 1850. So in situations like that, you'll have to clean a lot of the noise out of the sync sound, maybe replace stuff with ADR. Then crowd is most stuff, as you probably know, is filmed with extras in the background who won't be doing any talking. They'll all be pretending to do things in the background, so dance scenes and stuff. And then that stuff needs to be replaced with voice actors who will come in and kind of, depending on the size of the scene, you'll record as many voices as you need to kind of build up the reality. Then music, and this is where I suppose we cross over, don't we? This is, that's just basically explaining what I've just told you. Then music, where we cross over a bit, is I will tend to get in right at the end of a project before I do a final mix, and I'll go through some of this terminology later. Comes in as score and source. Score is specifically composed and recorded music for the project, which is called, I've got to think about it, it's non-diegetic, so it's kind of like the narrator. It's like a narrative above and beyond the what's happening on the screen. And then source, which is all the music kind of from radios, from phones playing ringtones, etc., TV, stuff like that. And then there's another word that I heard recently used, which I've started to use, which is brilliant, where somebody referred to the point where it goes between that classic thing where you have a piece of music on a radio in a love scene, and then as the love scene takes off, it then becomes score. They called it scorse, which I thought was a brilliant combination of the two words, which I'm starting to use a bit. And then, in addition to all that, because of the way stuff is filmed and the kind of almost like jigsaw nature that projects are made up, generally the dialogues will be quite cutty, they'll be clean, and you'll try and clean all the noises out the background and try and end up with just the voices on their own to give you complete flexibility, so at any point you can turn the sound effects down or the music up and the music down. So you have to have everything else added afterwards. So effects are all added, and the effects can be split down into three groups. So things like spots, which are individual things like gunshots, doors, etc., stuff like that. And then atmospheres, which are kind of winds, room tones, rain. That kind of sets the space. And then Foley, which is a kind of subset, I guess, of effects, which is specifically recorded stuff for the project. So footsteps, so that stuff which I'm doing, which actually doesn't record sometimes very well when you're recording on sets. And sometimes, for instance, I worked on the film AVP, and obviously that's just, obviously it's fantasy, it's not a documentary. Even though they're meant to be in some kind of underground pyramid, they were actually, I can't remember, somewhere in Bulgaria or somewhere, or in cardboard and wooden sets, basically. So everything they did just sounded terrible. I mean, when you first saw the first cut, it looked ridiculous because every time they closed the door, it was obviously a wooden door being closed. So as you kind of as you start to take the dialogues and add reverb to it to create the space, we then have to fill it up with things like the Foley, because we're trying to chop out the wooden footsteps as they're walking up the stone staircase, which is actually a wooden staircase painted to look like stone. So Foley's then added footsteps and cloth moves and my handling of this kind of. So that's all added separately. So my job is I come at the end of this. Hopefully I've been involved reasonably early on in the project, so to kind of see what's going on. And then I take all of these tracks, of which, for trying to think of a track count for a standard thing. So something like the Sherlock, the last episode of Sherlock went out, I think episode 3, just after Christmas, was about 300 or 400 tracks of audio, of individual audio, whether it's dialogues. I think there was like about 40 tracks of dialogues. The music was 5/1. And then I had mixes, but I also had stems. So I had string stems and keyboard stems and percussion stems. So I could get flexibility if we found that the music was clashing with the dialogue in a section. Say there was brass, which is a classic instrument that does interfere with dialogues. It's in the same frequency range. I would want to get in and turn the brass down. So maybe I didn't want to turn the whole music down because it was driving the emotion of the scene. And then the effects were 150 tracks. The Foley were about 24. Plus all the ancillary bits and the add-ons and the bits that the clients want at the end. So in the end, I mean, it was a 10-page scroll down, a large monitor on a Pro Tools to kind of run the session. And because I am unprepared, I can't remember what our next slide is. So the idea is, that's the idea. There's a mixing desk in the middle. I get lots of audio in, and then at the end, and I should change that really to say some kind of audio master that the clients and you or me are happy with as well. So working as a team, the idea is everyone works together and you end up with something that is helping to tell the story, is enhancing the drama of what's going on. Any questions?
approach for mixing if it was an animation or just like an emotion?
The question was is there a big difference in mixing for something like an animation? Yeah.
Compared to something that isn't animated.
I would say, yeah, I'd say the approach is different between the kind of film. So yes, animations and say romantic comedies and horror films, that's where the approach is different. Which actually, I'll quickly touch on that, because that's where I see the difference depending on the story. But actually, in a funny way, it depends on the kind of animation. So if it's a horror animation, I would probably mix it relatively similarly to a horror film, because you're still trying to tell the story with sound, and that story is about the shocks and the silence and the bangs, which you probably still would do with animation. The technical consideration of animation is of course, that you've got totally clean recording, so you have complete control, hence the panning, you know, Pixar films, where every single dialogue is panned exactly where it's meant to be, which is a flexibility you don't get on real life recordings, because you'll have a microphone and there'll be two people talking and it'll be pinned to one recording. So in a way, it goes more with the genre than the nature of... In fact, animation's slightly simpler because it is a much more controlled environment. But it does... The thing with animation is it does show you actually how much sound gets added to most dramas. So most of the dramas that I look after, in terms of drama, 90% of the sound's added afterwards anyway. So it's only 10% that you know, the animation is doing, which is the voice record. And that will actually lead on to another point, which is this convergence of, because sometimes I get asked the question as well, you know, what's the difference between TV mixing and film mixing? I think in the last 10 years, technology has changed so much, and Pro Tools has now just led to this kind of almost equipment communism, which has taken over the industry. And I think the music industry, maybe the music not as much, but certainly in post. Film and TV used to exist in two separate worlds. You had a set of equipment for film and a set of approaches, and you were mixing into 5:1 in a big space and big dynamic range. And TV was another set of equipment which you were mixing stereo, and you were mixing to a very limited dynamic range. I think the dynamic range thing is starting to change. You can now mix to a much wider dynamic range for TV. You can now deliver 5.1, but I've got a story about the BBC not transmitting 5.1. You're meant to be able to deliver 5.1, so you can mix 5.1, you can mix a wide dynamic range. And the technologies are now, it's all based on Pro Tools. So, for instance, I do everything in the box on Pro Tools, which I think I'm meant to talk a bit about as well. So any other questions, and then I'll move on to process and get into in-the-box mixing, stuff like that. Any more?
What percentage ADR and sync sound is it on most projects?
That's what's the percentage ADR and sync sound. Well, that's... I've got to be careful now so I don't slag off any sound recorders. Depends on the project. I did an episode of a TV show. I won't say it because in case, you know, I don't really find out the recorder's. It wasn't the recorder's fault. It was a very, very difficult shoot. Oh, right, it was Luther. And it was a very difficult shoot. And the guide track that came in with the video was beyond the car crash. I mean, beyond. It was just horrendous. You could hear every single cut, and any of the spaces were meant to be quiet were noisy, and all the noisy spaces were quiet. And it was just the opposite of what it was meant to be. And you couldn't, people were off mic, and then you would have shots like this, and the microphone would be at the back of the room. It would just be it was an absolute disaster. So we had a big meeting about it, and then the director and producer admitted that the first day's shoot was an entirely new crew who had not worked on it for 2 of the other series. And the first day was a disaster. They did too many setups. They did far too much filming, and no one had worked with each other. And that was most of the footage they used in the first episode. So, because it was good acting, but technically it was a bit of a disaster. So apparently the people in the grade had problems, and the editor had problems trying to cut around it, and we had problems. So that show like that ended up, I had to watch it the other day for technical reason. I realised about half of it was ADR. I mean, ideally, you wouldn't more than about 10-20% for real life problems. And also you get projects that maybe have not been written brilliantly or edited brilliantly, and there are plot holes, or it's not clear what's going on, and then you're crowbarring ADR in. So it does vary. I mean, it does vary. And there's been films I know that people have had nearly, can be up to 100% ADR if it's an absolute disaster. So, it varies. Any more questions before I move on? So, the job. So as I said, a normal drama track lay, so the amount of tracks I get in for a drama or film, and it is about the same now, is 300, 400, 500 tracks. So trying to mix 500 tracks of audio in every scene. So if you have a 30-second scene, you've got to go through 500 tracks and work out what bits you want to hear. Is impossible, and there's absolutely no way that you could get through the process of mixing it. So you have to break, like all these things, you have to break it down into individual tasks. So I start off with a dialogue premix where I take all these recordings and ADR, etc., and that's those blue bars that I didn't draw very well are meant to represent faders, by the way. I'm not a graphic designer, as you can tell. So lots of tracks come in to dialogues, and then I premix them and get a mix that I'm happy with, and then end up on the other side with a premix. And on my template in Pro Tools, actually all my dialogues end up on one fader. I have one fader ultimately, even though there might be 50 faders underneath the control of one fader, I end up with one fader, which is dialogues. And then at any point I can get into the individuals, because I'll be crazy to think that my premix was perfect over an hour, that I wouldn't need to make any changes. I'll then mix the effects, kind of mix the rest of the world around what's in the dialogue. So if I've got a difficult dialogue scene next to traffic and I can hear there's been quite a lot of editing, I'll mix maybe the traffic up that's been supplied by the effects track layer louder to kind of cover up some of the sins. And then that ends up on a few faders. It's about 4 or 5 faders under control, and that will literally be 200-300 tracks of faders that will then be represented by about 5 controlling them. Then there'll be a Foley premix if you get the time, and again that will be, on my template, represented by about 3 faders. So you're taking what is an absolutely enormous job and you're breaking it down into individual sections, and also artistically what you're doing is on this side, on the premix side, on the left-hand side with all the faders, you're doing the kind of nuts and bolts. I don't want to say boring work because I actually find it quite interesting, but essentially the kind of slightly nuts and bolts boring work where, making every mic sound the same and matching the ADR and adding the reverb and creating, if you're in the underground pyramid, you're making it sound like an underground pyramid. You're doing that work. So when you then come to the final mix where you'll then have the clients will then hopefully turn up and you'll sit in a room with the clients. Oh, that's the other thing I'll quickly say. So the pre-mixing I tend to do on my own. Generally the clients won't come in. Hopefully you've had a meeting with them beforehand. You'll know roughly what they want the project to sound like, what you're trying to do. Then I'll go away. So for a TV job, so Sherlock was about a week for that stuff on the left. And then you'll have a final mix with the clients who'll come in for about, again, Sherlock was about 4-day final, 3-4-day final with the clients in. And you'll work through what I'll call the macro, which is the fun stuff, which is the stuff where, if I had some examples prepared, I could show you, which is the fun stuff where you're doing the big, bold things. So in a show like Broadchurch, we did a lot of stuff where to add tension, we would just take all of the sync sound out, all the sound effects would come out, and the music would just take over. And it's in the final mix that stuff tends to happen. So, and on a film, so the timescale. So the other difference with film mixing is actually more of a budgetary timescale thing. So in films, generally a pre-mix these days, you get about 2 weeks to pre-mix and about a week to 2 weeks to final mix with the clients in the theatre. So any other questions? Any questions on that bit? And then I'll go into some more workflow stuff.
I assume you've got your effects sort of down to 4 or 5 faders. How do you split that up generally?
How do I split up my effects into my premix faders? Yeah, is that the question? So I've got quite a specific way of doing it, and it's something I try to kind of get the effects editors that I work with to present to me. I like the atmospheres for each. So the atmospheres are on 2 separate faders, and it's one scene like that and one scene like that. And then so across the scenes, I've got them on separate faders, because the biggest change you have to do to atmospheres tends to be between scenes. So your interior to exterior cuts, that's where you're going to do the most of your work. Not saying you don't care about the individual sounds, but if you're rushed or you're trying to get a globe or a big picture of what's going on, the biggest change is between atmosphere cuts. So I have 2 atmospheres, atmosphere A, atmosphere B, checkerboards. then the spot effects, and this is something that is now becoming kind of, I think it is an industry-wide thing, industry-wide, and it was born of massive track lays on the films where people are starting to conceptually split stuff up. So something like a Harry Potter template would have involved spot effects A, spot effects B, all the way down the alphabet with loads and loads of tracks in each bus. So for instance, in a gun battle, you would have gunshots, you'd have ricochets. If your effects editor was conscientious, you'd have shell casings dropping, maybe pan left and right as they're coming out of whooshes, bullet whooshes. And as a mixer, I would want the flexibility to get into the individual tracks of a gunshot, which would probably be made up of about, anywhere between 4 and 20 tracks, depending on who's track laying it. But on the initial premix, I wouldn't actually really want to get into the individual sounds. I just want, does the gunshot sound right coming out the box? Yes, right, so that's on one fader, that's on my effects bus A, and then I've got the ricochets on effects bus B, and I've got the shell casings on C. So I'll start mixing the scene. Generally, most of it goes through, sounds okay. These days as well with Pro Tools, it's been leveled up and you're presenting work that's kind of your idea of what it should sound like. And then if something wasn't quite right, or I felt one of the gunshots was too similar or wasn't quite telling the story and needed to be louder because it was a plot point gunshot, so your hero's killed, so that gunshot needs to stand out from the crowd, then you get into the individuals and kind of change it. And then Foley's then broken down into Foley feet, and this is more specifically, this is something I like to do just to give myself flexibility. Foley feet, Foley moves, and Foley spots. So, spots as in cuts being picked up and put down. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, on a project kind of like Broadchurch or Charlotte, one of the big TV dramas, how much of it is that you get to be kind of creative with what you're doing and sort of just kind of going through the motions to get the delivery?
So the question is on the kind of high-end drama, how much flexibility are you given? Well, it does depend on, it depends really on the clients as well. And also I have to say I have been, graced with a couple of corking projects to be given that we have been given almost, not carte blanche, you're never given carte blanche because it's a team effort. You're never going to just do something completely off the bat. You're going to listen to the thing that's given to you. You're going to talk to clients and try and deliver what they want. But Tinker Tailor being one and Sherlock being another, we were given quite a wide range to do what we want, especially in something like Sherlock, because so much of it is fantasy. It's such a cartoon thing anyway, that all that Mind Palace stuff and his weird stuff, that's entirely constructed, and the grammar of that, isn't known or wasn't known until we started doing it. And even on the latter episodes, and the question I do get asked occasionally is like, well, how do you set those things up? Is it all decided? It's kind of track laid with a rough idea, but with comedy as well, because it is fantasy comedy. It's really difficult, and what happens is you just go through it bit by bit, and you kind of find your way through it until you're happy with it. And it's about instinctively knowing when it's right or when it's not right. And so that grammar is kind of made up as the series are edited and mixed, and then that goes back. And funny enough, all the stuff that was done on the first series went back to the cutting room for the second series. They started cutting with the same sound effects, so the grammar. And then it gets redelivered to us, and we change it a bit more depending on the story. Something like that, you're given a lot of carte blanche. Broadchurch, less so, because when we saw an early cut of Broadchurch, we were invited to go in very early, because I knew the exec producer quite well, and he wanted very much a top-down approach to the sound, as in he wanted us in early, so we could watch it with them on an early cut, and we could have a tone meeting and try and guide it at that point. What did we like about the early cut? What didn't we like? A lot of that was set on that early on some of the early screenings we saw. And so actually we didn't stray that much. We didn't try to stray that much because a lot of it worked as well. And I think that's really important. Your first viewing of a project is I always think it's the most important time that you ever see something, because the first time you see something is kind of how most people are going to see it. The second time you see it, you'll be tainted with, you'll be watching it in a different way. You'll be watching it knowing that you haven't got enough time, that you haven't got enough money or resources, and you'll be panicking and worrying about the technicalities. But the first time you watch something, you'll have an emotional response to it. And something like Broadchurch, we were very careful in remembering our emotional response to key bits, and so we didn't change them. We just went with whatever they did. So that one was kind of locked down. So it's really very project dependent. Any other?
How long would it take,
Picture editing or sound editing? Sound editing. So the question is how long the sound editing would take. A TV show, currently TV show is 4 weeks linear. So Broadchurch went through my own company, my own sound company. So for that we allocated 2 weeks dialogue editing, 2 weeks effects editing. ADR was recorded in that 2 weeks and edited. Foley was recorded by a third team somewhere else in 3 days. Music was recorded by another team in, I think it was Norway or Iceland or somewhere weird, and then sent back to us. And then, so we had, I'm trying to think, we had 3 or 4 teams going over about a 2-week period, so whatever that adds up to about, I suppose, 6 to 8 weeks. Feature film, dialogues would be, I mean, features are so variable at the moment. Some people do them in a week, some people take months. You know, big Hollywood features, they'll be editing for months and months and months. But on the whole, generally about 6 weeks, comfortable for dialogues, 6 weeks for effects, so 12 weeks in total, and then Foley for about a week. Music record, I mean, that again, that depends. That's quite quick, actually. Score recording and mixing can be quite quick, invariably, because it seems to be done at the last minute and done to the wire. And I'm amazed how quickly the score engineers turn stuff around and how good it sounds, considering how tight the deadlines are. So it's very variable, but budget dictates a lot of that. Any other?
Just in addition to that answer, when you said for Broadchurch, you referring to an episode, or was it done in one hit and then split?
Did I do something like Broadchurch in one hit or split into episodes? Episodic, especially with episodic TV, because you do get a bit of a hairy moment in episodic TV where you are mixing and the thing is being transmitted. Obviously not with your mixing, that would be a little bit too scary, but you are mixing, and as you're halfway through the series, they're starting to transmit it. Or in the very extreme case, a friend of mine who I rang up a few months ago and asked him to come out to the pub, and he said he couldn't come out to the pub because he was working on something, a Derren Brown thing. And I said, oh, doesn't worry about that, you'll be fine. He goes, no, it's going out at 8 this evening, and this was at 6. So sometimes it can be a bit, you know, you're mixing and there's a guy in reception waiting to pick up your master that you hope is resilient at that point. Any other questions? Okay, let me. Traditional mix rate. Right, so, and this is something I do want to talk about a bit and discuss, is because I guess you're all using Pro Tools and Logic and mixing in the box and not mixing in the box. So a traditional mix route prior to, say, 5 years ago, before Pro Tools took the entire post-production world over in conjunction with Avid, was you would get all your sound rushes in from the editorial department, picture editorial department. A sound editorial team would do the editing that we talked about. They would then deliver a track lay to an old desk. That desk on the right is an AMS DFC. So the audio would pass through the mixing desk, and you would do the pre-mix, then you do the final mix. Prior to about 10 years ago, you would have to actually kind of record bits down because the desks weren't big enough. The track lay started to become bigger than the desks, so you'd have to take your 60 dialogue tracks and make an 8-track pre-mix, which of course meant you'd tie stuff together, so you'd lose a bit of flexibility. And then you'd sit there with the clients and you finish the mix, and great, and then you have an audio master. So that's up to about 5 years ago, and then Pro Tools mix, not engine, I suppose system, software got revamped. They actually, Avid, or DigiDesign as they were at the time, employed a chap called Doug Ford who designed that mixing desk, which is one of the finest mixing desks I've ever used, and he nicked most of the mix ideas from that desk and put it into Pro Tools. Suddenly Pro Tools became this fantastic, this thing does everything that desk does. This is amazing, and it's 1/100th of the price, and it opens up this possibility where you have the same process, editing and mixing. You edit it in Pro Tools, but you mix it in Pro Tools, but you mix it on a mixing desk in Pro Tools, which then opens up this bit where suddenly you're not bound to just feed the audio one way to a mixing desk and mix it and make some audio masters. If there are any changes, or if things aren't working, or the most important bit, because can I go backwards? Yes, I can. Going that way, if you start a job here, so you're editing on the left, and what happens, and this happens quite a lot, more than it should do these days, is there are picture changes in the project that you're actually mixing. So everyone's track laid, everyone's worked on the same pitch, and suddenly you get a phone call. Generally, it tends to happen on a Friday afternoon near the end of the week, and they've decided that they've done some picture changes, which obviously has a massive implication on everything, on all of your audios. And sometimes you get the concept, but I've only taken 2 frames out. You go, yeah, but you've taken 2 frames out at the beginning of the project, so the rest of the project is now 2 frames out of sync. Where are the 2 frames, and we now have to conform everything? And in extreme cases, I mean, on something like AVP, we mixed, I can't remember, either Reel 3 or Reel 4, which was unbelievably complicated reel. It's a classic Hollywood structure. So Reel 4 has all of the action in it, and it's just, every scene was just about 20 seconds long, and it was constant action. I spent 3 days pre-mixing in a theatre in Camden and got a lovely shape on this thing, which was very complicated. And then we were at Shepperton doing the final mix, and I was just kind of there as a mix advisor as they were doing the final mix. And then we found out they re-edited Reel 4. They did 200 cuts to Reel 4. They absolutely, totally shredded it, which just lost the entire shape. So I had to then mix, and in fact they did it to about 3 reels. In fact, half of AVP was mixed in a cutting room in Shepperton on a little Command 8 on a Pro Tools, on a telly with speakers just in front of me like that, because they just shredded mixes, so we had to go back to the drawing board and kind of redo stuff. So for various reasons, you don't want to just have the audio going that way. You want to be able to just go backwards and forwards. So the reason I've done the arrows both ways is if there are edits, so you start off with the edit, you start doing the mix, you get the call that they've done some edit changes, then you give it back to the editorial department. They then conform everything, make everything work. And in Pro Tools, which is a great system for this, you can see where the edits are, you can see where the sound jumps, and you can smooth stuff off. Then you can present it back to the mix and we can carry on. Or if scenes don't work, for instance, I mean, in everything I've done, generally there will be a scene or something that might be a contentious scene that nobody can agree on. If it's not working, then you send it back to the editorial department. They can carry on working on it, add bits that need to, and then send it back to you to leave you to carry on working. So opening the flexibility and doing everything in the box is liberating. The other thing is, in terms of the way I work, and I think modern workflows, is by having everything in one box means nowadays that I can kind of go into any theatre in the country, pretty much as a Pro Tools, and carry on working. So I found myself at one point, I think during the last Sherlock, where I had 2 other jobs overrunning because they're just overrun for edit reasons, actually. Fun enough, they kept re-editing the picture and changing some of the graphics in shots and stuff. So I found myself finishing Sherlock at 6, 7 in the evening and having to open up another session because I was in the Pro Tools and I had the sessions with me on a drive. I could open them up and carry on working, carry on making changes, send stuff back on the internet to the clients to approve, and then the episodes could be signed off. And to the extreme case, I actually went on a kind of working holiday to LA and I had the drive with me and the changes were still going on. And at one point we were looking at getting a dubbing theatre in LA to finish off so we could carry on working. So that is an absolute total revolution in terms of post, which actually, I know it's been going to be happening in music quite a long time, but in post has only really come to fruition in the last kind of 5, 10 years where people are just walking around with drives and iLocks and going to different stages and carrying on with work. Thank you very much. Thank you.